So we were just in the vineyard,
Yes.
from where this wine came. Tell us about this wine.
Well, this is the 2008 version of our Lytton Springs Zinfandel blend. If you notice on the label, it just says Lytton Springs. At the bottom of our label, it says 74% Zinfandel, 21% Petit Syrah, 5% Carignan, Dry Creek Valley. So we cannot legally call this a Zinfandel because it's less than 75% Zin. But it's heart and soul are those vines, grapes from those vines right outside.
Okay. Let's taste some wine.
Great. So one thing you notice about Zinfandel is that it has a nice garnet color. It's maybe not quite as dark as Petit Syrah or as maybe a Napa Cabernet, but it's got this really nice kind of garnet color. The best part of Zin for me, of Lytton Springs Zin, are two really good things for me. One is the nose. It's got, for me, it's pretty typical of Dry Creek Valley. It's raspberry, blackberry, a little bit of kind of bramble, like you're picking wild blackberries on a hot July day.
Mm-hmm.
There's a hint of almost mint in there, maybe fennel, perhaps. But the Zinfandel character on this, there's a little bit of cherry, but it's mainly the blackberry, raspberry. I don't know if that's what you're
Got it. Well, it's funny that you said fennel because I kind of interpreted that more for me like a little bit of menthol.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah,
in there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's Dry Creek Zin. The other favorite part for me is on the palate.
Mm-hmm.
So, Zinfandel is this really luscious, fruity, generous wine. It doesn't have a lot of tannin. The Petit Syrah, because there's such a high percentage of Petit Syrah in this wine, it really wraps around your tongue, fills up the mid palate, and really helps with the finish on Zin. So for me, there's more of that kind of brambly fruit, the classic Dry Creek. Then there's this dustiness to the tannins, mostly from the Petit Syrah, and it has this really long kind of. I like to describe it as a gravelly finish. Mm-hmm. That's simply the way the tannins and the acid and the fruit kind of runs across your tongue as you swallow, and I like that very much.
Yeah, definitely. The finish goes on forever.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's pretty. Mm-hmm. It's interesting because the texture and the body of the wine is not that heavy.
Right.
It's kind of a fresh, clean flavor, but when it finishes, it is kind of gravelly, as you say. Just on the stronger side than you would expect from the mouthfeel. So that's fascinating. So is there anything you can tell us about the winemaking techniques that went into making this wine?
Sure. We can start with the kind of basic Ridge philosophy of minimal intervention and native yeast, so we don't add any yeast to this. We don't add any malolactic bacteria, so everything is just whatever's on the vine, on the grapes, in the winery. Winemaking is very ancient process. It's the first kind of thing that humans did, 8 or 10,000 years ago. And grapes and honey is what they used to start this whole journey that's become, $2,000 bottles of wine, whatever. This doesn't cost $2,000. But so it's easy to do. It's harder in modern times, it's harder to just kind of let nature take its course. Mm-hmm. We do, like I say, minimal intervention, but maximum attention. So we're very cognizant of what the acid is, what the pH is of the wine, where the fermentation is going. We're always tasting every day, tasting the wines as they're fermenting several times a day. We do pump overs on this wine, which means that we draw the liquid from the bottom of the fermenting tank, which is a jacketed stainless steel tank. We draw it out of the bottom, put it into a tub so that we can aerate it and get the yeasts nice and happy. Then that wine goes back up via a little pump over the top, and it's got we call it an irrigator, but it's basically a splash plate. The wine hits the splash plate and scatters over the cap, which are the skins and seeds of the wine, are held up on top of the floating must because of the CO2 that gets trapped underneath them. By irrigating the wine over that, you extract tannin and color from the wine, because most of the tannin and color are in the skins of the grape. There's a little bit of tannin in the seeds. The way we like to make wine, are fairly short, hot fermentation. So if you want to get technical, we go kind of like sublethal temperatures in the high 80s, low 90s, sublethal to the yeast. If it gets much hotter than that, you'll kill the yeast and then your fermentation will stop. We do that so that we can extract as much color and tannin from the skins as possible without getting too much of the tannin from the seeds. We don't like the seed tannin because it's a little too bitter. By short fermentations, we're anywhere between 6 and 10 days. Zinfandel, typically a little bit more than, say, the Petit Syrah that goes into this. That's more like 4 or 5 or 6 day fermentation. Because we don't add any yeast to it, it sometimes will take a day or two to actually start fermenting. But that's we just let it go.
Why the decision to use native yeast?
It goes back to it's pre-Paul Draper, actually, so it's pre-1969, when back in the early 60s when this winery was going, there weren't really commercial yeasts out there. You didn't really have that. As they became more prevalent and common to be used, mostly through a lot of research done at UC Davis, you could get really nice, clean fermentations. It's great for a high-volume, large capacity winery where you need to clear your tanks up. You need to get a lot of wine through really quickly. And commercial yeast do a great job of doing that. I mean, they even now have engineered yeast that won't throw off hydrogen sulfide, which is a rotten eggs odor that sometimes happens to wines. Well, the difference between bombarding is what the word I would use, inoculating with a large amount of a commercial yeast of one single similar genetic biotype of yeast into a wine versus letting probably between 10 and 20 different yeasts and bacteria begin the fermentation. It's all about complexity. So the fermentation, when you have a naturally occurring one, it actually starts really slowly. And like I said, there are lots of spoilage organisms starting on the grapes because they're high sugar and nice temperatures and easy to eat. By the time a little bit of alcohol is built up, say 1%, 1.5% alcohol, really the only yeast that's left there is Saccharomyces cerevisiae, whichever different strains were existing on those grapes. And then they take off and finish the fermentation. The beauty of that is all those other little organisms in there add complexity to the nose and the aroma of the wine, and they also add their dead bodies to help nourish the yeast so that you don't get a huge spike in yeast population and then it crashes out because it runs out of food. So it makes a somewhat slower fermentation. So and it adds complexity. Back in the mid-90s, we purchased some fruit from a Mataro vineyard, a Mourvedre vineyard, and we had never worked with that vineyard before. Well, we had 2 5-ton lots. So we added a small amount of commercial yeast to one of those lots and let the other one go on its own because we weren't sure what it was going to do, and it were the first grapes into the winery that year. Well, before we blended those 2 tanks together and made this Mataro for our tasting program, we took a case of each of those lots and bottled it separately. Well, 15 years later, we pulled open a couple of those bottles, and one of the wines was dead. It was gone, no life left to it, kind of over the hill. The other one had nuance. It had some complexity. It was still very old, but you could drink it, and that was the one on native yeast. So
I see.
And I think it makes the wine more complex. And complexity, diversity is the spice of life.
What is the total current production for Ridge nowadays?
Ridge, we're 2 wineries in one. Our total production is right around 80,000 cases. So we're still considered a small winery, but on the small winery scale, we're on the large side.
Right, and this Zinfandel production is?
This is anywhere between 12 and 15,000 cases of Ridge Witten Springs.
Got it. Okay, wonderful. Mm-hmm. David, thank you so much for your time today.
You're welcome. Cheers.
Yes, thank you.
Drinking Zin.